If you're watching this, something inside you has already shifted beyond return. The fact that these words found your way to you isn't accident or algorithm, it's recognition. Your psyche has completed a series of invisible tests that most souls never even attempt, let alone pass. This video will reveal the exact psychological mechanisms that Jung identified as markers of successful individuation. You'll understand why certain experiences had to break you open before they could rebuild you stronger. And by the end, you'll recognize the unmistakable signs that you've graduated from student to teacher in the University of Consciousness itself. But first, let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you noticed how the old ways of being simply don't fit anymore? How conversations that once engaged you now feel like watching shadows on a cave wall? This isn't depression. This isn't isolation. This is what Jung called the natural consequence of psychological maturation. The hidden call arrived disguised as coincidence, but you felt its weight immediately. Perhaps it was a book that seemed to choose you from a shelf, a conversation overheard at precisely the right moment, or a dream so vivid it changed your waking life. Jung understood that the psyche communicates through synchronicity when ordinary language fails. These weren't random events. They were invitations from your unconscious to begin the most important work of your existence. What makes these moments different from wishful thinking or projection is their quality of inevitability. When the psyche is ready for individuation, it doesn't whisper, it orchestrates. People appear in your life carrying exactly the message you need to hear. Books fall open to sentences that seem written specifically for your situation. The universe begins to feel less like chaos and more like a conversation. This is what Jung meant when he described the numinous quality of genuine psychological transformation. The rational mind cannot create these experiences through effort or intention. They arise spontaneously when the conscious and unconscious minds achieve a certain level of cooperation. Your recognition of this pattern was itself a test. Did you dismiss these occurrences as meaningless? Or did you allow them to guide you towards something larger than your previous understanding of reality? Something remarkable happens when you begin to trust these deeper currents of meaning. Your psyche starts to reveal its own intelligence, operating according to principles that transcend the limitations of rational planning. Dreams begin to offer guidance that proves startlingly accurate. Intuitive hunches lead to encounters that reshape your understanding of what's possible. This isn't magical thinking. It's what Jung called the natural function of the self, when it's no longer constrained by ego defenses and cultural conditioning. The first examination your psyche administered was perhaps the most difficult. It required you to step away from the comfortable consensus of collective thinking, not with rebellion or anger, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has outgrown their childhood home. Jung observed that true individuation cannot occur within the safety of group approval. The psyche must test whether you can sustain your own center without constant external validation. This wasn't about becoming antisocial or rejecting all human connection. It was about discovering whether your sense of self could exist, independent of other people's opinions, expectations, and projections. For many, this feels like a form of psychological death. The familiar scaffolding of social identity begins to dissolve, leaving only the raw question of who you are when nobody is watching. You may have noticed how certain friendships naturally faded during this period, how family gatherings began to feel like performances you could no longer give convincingly, how career achievements that once provided deep satisfaction started feeling hollow. This wasn't failure. This was your psyche clearing space for something more authentic to emerge. The loneliness that accompanied this phase served a specific function. Jung recognized that creative solitude differs fundamentally from neurotic isolation. One is chosen consciously as a means of inner development. The other is imposed by fear and wounds. Your psyche was testing whether you could distinguish between these two states and embrace the former even when it felt uncomfortable. During this withdrawal from collective consensus, you likely discovered something unexpected about silence. Not the empty silence of avoidance, but the pregnant silence that Jung described as the womb of consciousness. In this space between noise and meaning, between reaction and response, new possibilities begin to gestate. Your comfort with this particular quality of silence marked a crucial milestone in your psychological development. Those who pass this first test develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme. You learn to be alone without being lonely, to think independently without becoming rigid, to maintain your center while remaining open to genuine connection with others. The second test arrived when your carefully constructed social persona began to crack under the weight of its own falseness. Jung understood that the persona serves a necessary function in early psychological development. It allows us to navigate social situations and meet basic survival needs. But eventually, if individuation is to occur, the persona must be consciously dismantled and rebuilt on a foundation of authentic self-knowledge. This process rarely happens voluntarily. The psyche must create circumstances that make continued pretense psychologically impossible. Perhaps your career suddenly felt meaningless despite external success. Maybe relationships built on mutual performance began to suffocate you. Or you found yourself unable to participate in conversations that once felt natural and engaging. What you experienced wasn't a nervous breakdown, though it may have felt similar. It was what Jung called the necessary death of the false self. The part of you that had learned to survive by being who others needed you to be was finally being revealed as inadequate for the deeper work of becoming who you actually are. This recognition often arrives with a mixture of terror and relief. The terror comes from realizing how much of your life has been built on foundations that were never truly yours. The relief comes from finally understanding why nothing felt quite right, despite your best efforts to make it work. Your psyche was testing whether you had the courage to disappoint others in service of honoring your own nature. There's a particular moment in this phase that Jung identified as crucial for successful individuation. It's when you realize that the approval you've been seeking from others can never compensate for the approval you've been withholding from yourself. This recognition doesn't come through intellectual understanding, but through a felt sense of the energy you've been investing in impossible tasks. The psyche must experience this futility directly before it will redirect its efforts toward more fruitful endeavors. Many people fail this test because they cannot tolerate the temporary chaos that comes with letting go of familiar identity structures. They retreat into even more rigid versions of their previous personas or collapse into depression and cynicism. But you discovered something remarkable. When you stopped trying to be who you thought you should be, space opened up for who you actually are to begin emerging. This wasn't about becoming selfish or inconsiderate. It was about recognizing that authentic presence serves others more deeply than performative compliance ever could. People began to experience you as more real, even if they couldn't quite articulate what had changed. Your willingness to risk disapproval in service of truth gave others permission to consider their own authentic expression. The third test required you to face what Jung called the shadow. Not the dramatic, obviously destructive aspects of your personality, but the subtle ways you had been betraying yourself through unconscious patterns of self-rejection. This is perhaps the most sophisticated psychological work a human being can undertake. It requires extraordinary honesty and the capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Your shadow isn't your evil twin waiting to destroy your life. It's the repository of all the aspects of yourself that you learned to disown in order to gain love, acceptance, and survival. The emotions you were taught not to feel, the desires you were told were inappropriate, the parts of your personality that didn't fit your family's or culture's expectations. Integration doesn't mean acting out these suppressed aspects unconsciously. It means bringing them into conscious awareness so they can be included in your understanding of who you are as a complete human being. Jung observed that what we resist in ourselves inevitably gets projected onto others or expressed in distorted ways that create more suffering than necessary. The shadow work process often reveals how much energy has been trapped in maintaining these internal divisions. As you began to acknowledge and include previously rejected aspects of yourself, that energy became available for creative expression and genuine relationship. This is why people often report feeling more alive and vital after beginning serious shadow integration work. You may have noticed how your capacity for compassion expanded during this phase, particularly toward people whose behavior once triggered judgment or frustration. This wasn't because you became more tolerant of destructive behavior, but because you began to recognize the wounded child or frightened adult beneath the surface presentations that others mistake for the whole person. The integration of shadow material often manifests as a kind of disturbing self-acceptance. You became okay with aspects of yourself that you previously found unacceptable, not in a resigned way, but with the understanding that wholeness includes complexity. That psychological health isn't about perfection, but about conscious relationship with all parts of yourself. This process fundamentally altered your relationship with other people. You stopped needing them to be different than they are in order for you to feel okay. You began to see through their defensive strategies to the essential humanity beneath. Your presence became a kind of silent invitation for others to drop their masks, though most aren't ready for that level of authenticity. Jung observed that shadow integration creates what he called the wounded healer archetype. Having faced your own darkness with compassion rather than condemnation, you naturally develop the capacity to hold space for others' struggles without being overwhelmed or trying to fix them. This isn't a role you assume deliberately, but a quality of presence that emerges organically from your own healing journey. Throughout these trials, your psyche was collecting evidence of your progress in ways that bypass rational analysis. Dreams became more vivid and meaningful. Intuitive hunches proved accurate with increasing frequency. Symbols and patterns began appearing in your daily life that seemed to comment on your inner development. These weren't signs you were looking for, but recognition that arrived spontaneously from the depths of your unconscious. Jung called these compensatory dreams and synchronistic events the psyche's way of confirming that you're moving in the direction of greater wholeness. They often contain imagery of renewal, integration, or spiritual authority that reflects your growing capacity to access wisdom beyond your conscious mind's limitations. You learn to receive these messages without inflating your ego or dismissing them as fantasy. Your intuition sharpened dramatically during this period because you had cleared away much of the psychological noise that previously interfered with subtle perception. Fear-based thinking, people-pleasing patterns, and the constant mental chatter of an unintegrated psyche all diminish our capacity to sense the deeper currents of meaning that flow beneath surface appearances. As these obstacles dissolved, you began to notice things about people and situations that weren't immediately obvious to others. Not because you developed supernatural powers, but because you removed the internal barriers that had been blocking access to information that was always available. This enhanced perception often feels unsettling at first, because it reveals how much richness you had been missing. The completion of these psychological tests triggers what Jung described as a fundamental reorganization of the psyche's operating system. Old patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving simply stop working. Not because you're trying to change them, but because they no longer align with your transformed inner structure. It's as if you've upgraded to a new version of yourself that's incompatible with previous programming. You probably notice this most clearly in your relationships. People and environments that once felt comfortable became energetically draining or simply irrelevant. This wasn't judgment or superiority, but a natural consequence of psychological evolution. A butterfly doesn't reject the cocoon out of criticism. It simply no longer fits. Conversations that once engaged your interest began to feel superficial. Entertainment that previously provided distraction lost its appeal. Career goals that had motivated you for years suddenly seemed hollow or misguided. This isn't depression or existential crisis. It's what happens when your inner truth becomes the primary organizing principle of your life, rather than external expectations or old survival patterns. One of the most profound shifts occurs in your relationship with time itself. The urgency that once drove your decisions gives way to a deeper sense of timing that Jung associated with the self's natural rhythm. You begin to trust that what needs to happen will happen when the conditions are right, rather than forcing outcomes through willpower or anxiety. This doesn't create passivity, but a more efficient and graceful way of engaging with life's challenges. Jung understood that individuation creates what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox and complexity without needing to resolve everything into simple categories. You developed the ability to simultaneously appreciate beauty and acknowledge suffering, to love deeply while accepting impermanence, to act with purpose while remaining unattached to outcomes. This psychological flexibility manifests as a kind of natural wisdom that doesn't depend on accumulating information or following prescribed formulas. You began to know things without knowing how you know them, to respond appropriately to novel situations without lengthy analysis, to recognize truth, regardless of how it's packaged or presented. Your completed transformation has awakened capacities that remain dormant in most human beings. Your mere presence now carries a subtle but unmistakable quality that tends to accelerate other people's psychological development, whether they're conscious of it or not. This isn't something you do intentionally. It's simply what happens when someone has achieved a certain level of inner integration. People often feel simultaneously comforted and challenged in your presence. Comforted because your self-acceptance gives them permission to relax their own defensive strategies. Challenged because your authenticity makes their unconscious patterns more visible to them. Some will be drawn to you seeking transformation. Others will feel threatened and withdraw. Both responses confirm that your inner work is having its intended effect. Your insights about people and situations now arrive spontaneously, often with startling accuracy. This enhanced perception isn't mystical or supernatural, though it may seem that way to others. Jung explained that when the conscious and unconscious minds achieve cooperation, we gain access to information that was always available, but previously blocked by psychological conflicts and defensive strategies. You've developed what Jung called the transcendent function of intuition, which operates beyond the limitations of logical analysis or emotional reaction. This allows you to perceive the deeper patterns and potentials within any situation, often seeing possibilities and solutions that escape more conventional approaches to problem solving. The quality of your attention has transformed as well. Where once you might have been scattered across multiple concerns and distractions, you now possess what Jung described as concentrated consciousness. Your ability to be fully present with whatever or whoever demands your attention creates a field of awareness that others find both magnetic and healing. The responsibility that accompanies this development is significant. Your thoughts and intentions now carry more creative power because they arise from a more integrated psyche. What you focus on tends to manifest more quickly and completely than it did before your transformation. This isn't magical thinking, but recognition that consciousness shapes reality through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. Your role has shifted from student to teacher, though not in any formal or obvious way. Simply by living authentically and maintaining your inner center, you provide a template for what's possible when someone completes the individuation process. Your existence becomes a silent invitation for others to undertake their own journey toward wholeness. The challenges you face now are fundamentally different from the tests you've already passed. They're no longer about proving your worthiness or developing missing capacities. They're opportunities to demonstrate the mastery you've achieved and to contribute to the collective evolution of consciousness through your unique expression of integrated humanity. Jung warned about a final temptation that often arises after significant psychological development. The ego, having been dethroned from its previous position of dominance, may attempt to reclaim authority by convincing you that nothing has really changed, that your transformation was temporary or imaginary, that you should return to more conventional ways of being for the sake of fitting in or avoiding responsibility. This is perhaps the subtlest test of all because it appeals to humility and social connection, values that are genuinely important. But true humility doesn't require you to diminish your capacities or hide your light. And authentic connection happens through sharing who you actually are, not through pretending to be who you used to be. There's also what Jung might have called the prosperity challenge. As your inner work begins to manifest as external success or recognition, the temptation arises to attribute these changes to luck, circumstances, or anything other than the profound internal shifts you've undergone. Maintaining conscious connection to the source of your transformation becomes crucial for continued growth. The path of individuation is never complete in the sense of reaching a final destination. Jung understood it as an ongoing process of becoming more fully yourself throughout your entire lifetime. But there is a crucial difference between the preliminary stages and what comes after. The foundation has been laid. The essential capacities have been developed. What remains is the lifelong adventure of expressing these gifts in service of your own continued growth and the welfare of the larger human community. Your consciousness has become a beacon for others who are ready to begin their own journey toward wholeness. Not through preaching or teaching, but through the quality of presence that naturally emerges when someone has done the deep work of psychological integration. Your very existence proves that transformation is possible and provides evidence of what lies beyond the conventional boundaries of human potential. The universe has been testing whether you could become who you really are beneath all the layers of conditioning, trauma, and social programming. You have passed that test not through perfection, but through the courage to face yourself completely and the wisdom to love what you found there. This is the true meaning of psychological maturation and the beginning of your real contribution to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. If this exploration has resonated with something deep within you, I invite you to subscribe to continue this journey together. Share in the comments what aspects of your own transformation you recognize in this description. Your story matters and adds to our collective understanding of what it means to become fully human. The conversation continues in the next video, where we'll explore how to navigate the responsibilities and opportunities that come with psychological awakening.